Chapter 1, June 1944. A second front in the East. June 1944. Across Europe, attention is fixed on the beaches of Normandy. Allied forces have landed in France, and for the first time since 1940 Germany is fighting a major war on the Western Front again. Newspapers, radios, and military headquarters follow every development in northern France. But while the world watches Normandy, a far larger storm is forming in the east. Thousands of kilometers away, across the forests and marshes of Belarus, the Soviet Union is preparing one of the most massive military offensives of the entire Second World War. The scale of this operation will dwarf almost anything happening in Western Europe. The operation is named Bagration, after the Russian general Pyotr Bagration who fought against Napoleon in 1812. Within weeks, it will destroy an entire German army group. Not weaken it, not push it back, destroy it. But to understand how Operation Bagration became possible, it is necessary to understand the situation on the Eastern Front in 1944. 3 years earlier, in June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. Millions of German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in a massive surprise attack that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. In the early months of that campaign, the German army achieved enormous victories. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Cities fell rapidly. German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. For a time, it appeared that the Soviet Union might collapse. But the war did not end in 1941. The Soviet state survived. Its industry was relocated east of the Ural Mountains. New armies were raised, trained, and equipped. The Red Army learned from its early disasters. By 1943, the balance of power had begun to change. The German defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943 marked a major turning point. For the first time, a large German field army had been completely destroyed. Later that same year, the Battle of Kursk ended Germany's ability to launch major offensives in the east. After Kursk, the initiative increasingly belonged to the Soviet Union. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, Soviet forces pushed westward across Ukraine and southern Russia. German armies were forced into repeated retreats. Yet despite these setbacks, Germany still controlled vast territories in Eastern Europe. One of the most important positions was Belarus, where German Army Group Center held a long defensive line. Army Group Center was one of the strongest German formations on the Eastern Front. It had survived years of fighting and remained positioned roughly in the center of the German defensive system. From the German perspective, this sector appeared relatively stable. The Red Army had launched several offensives elsewhere along the front, particularly in Ukraine. As a result, German commanders believed the main Soviet attacks would continue in the south. Belarus was not considered the most dangerous sector. This assumption would prove catastrophic. While German attention focused elsewhere, Soviet planners were preparing an enormous offensive precisely against Army Group Center. The goal was not simply to push the Germans back. It was to break the front completely. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin and senior commanders such as Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had reached an important conclusion by 1944. Germany could not defeat the Soviet Union quickly. But Germany could be defeated through continuous pressure and overwhelming force. Instead of isolated offensives, the Red Army would coordinate massive operations designed to destroy entire German formations. Operation Bagration was designed according to this principle. The scale of preparation was enormous. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers would participate in the offensive. They were supported by thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, large formations of aircraft. Entire armies were moved into position over weeks and months. Railways transported equipment and ammunition toward the front lines. Bridges were constructed. Supply depots were established. All of this had to be done while hiding Soviet intentions from German intelligence. Deception became a critical element of the plan. Soviet commanders used false troop movements, dummy equipment, and misleading radio communications to convince German observers that the main offensive would occur further south. This type of deception was known in Soviet doctrine as maskirovka, a comprehensive system of military camouflage and misinformation. German intelligence reports reflected this deception. Many German commanders believed that the main Soviet effort would target Army Group North Ukraine, not Army Group Center. As a result, Reinforcements were sent south. Meanwhile, Soviet forces quietly concentrated in Belarus. The Germans were about to face one of the greatest offensives of the war in a sector they believed was relatively safe. Timing also played an important symbolic role. The Soviet offensive would begin on June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. For the Soviet Union, the date carried deep meaning. 3 years earlier, German armies had invaded the Soviet homeland and inflicted catastrophic destruction. Now the Red Army would launch a massive counterstroke on the same anniversary. But symbolism alone did not determine military success. What truly mattered was preparation. And by the summer of 1944, the Red Army had become a very different force from the one Germany encountered in 1941. It had learned how to coordinate large-scale operations involving infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. It had developed improved logistics. Its commanders had gained years of combat experience. Most importantly, Soviet industry was producing enormous quantities of weapons. Factories far beyond German bomber range were producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition at staggering rates. Germany, by contrast, was fighting a war on multiple fronts while its cities and factories were increasingly under Allied bombing. The balance of industrial power had shifted dramatically. Operation Bagration would bring that imbalance to the battlefield. On paper, Army Group Center still appeared strong. But beneath the surface, the German defensive system was more fragile than many commanders realized. When the Soviet offensive began, the scale and coordination of the attack would overwhelm German defenses faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, an entire German army group would collapse. The Eastern Front would move hundreds of kilometers westward, and the road toward Poland, and eventually Berlin, would begin to open. The storm was gathering, and on June 22, 1944, it would break. Chapter 2: Germany's Fragile Front. By the summer of 1944, the German army on the Eastern Front still appeared powerful on maps. Long lines of defensive positions stretched across Eastern Europe. Millions of soldiers remained under German command. Hundreds of divisions still held territory captured during earlier phases of the war. But appearances were deceptive. Behind the front lines, the German military machine was under enormous strain. 3 years of continuous fighting had consumed vast amounts of manpower, equipment, and fuel. Entire divisions had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Experienced officers and veteran soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in earlier battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. The German army that held the Eastern Front in 1944 was not the same force that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Many units were now composed of replacements with less training and less experience. Equipment shortages had become common. Vehicles were worn out. Artillery ammunition was limited. Fuel shortages were growing more severe. Germany was now fighting a global war on multiple fronts. In the West, Allied armies had landed in France. In the South, German forces were struggling in Italy. In the air, Allied bombing campaigns were striking German cities and factories almost daily. The German military leadership faced an impossible task: defending enormous territories with shrinking resources. Nowhere was this problem more dangerous than on the Eastern Front. The front line stretched for thousands of kilometers. Holding such a line required large numbers of troops, but Germany no longer had enough manpower to maintain strong defenses everywhere. Some sectors were heavily fortified. Others were thinly defended. The challenge for German commanders was determining where the next Soviet offensive would occur. This was not an easy problem. The Soviet Union had developed effective methods of deception. Troop movements were hidden. Fake radio communications were transmitted. Entire armies could be moved into position while giving the impression that they were preparing to attack somewhere else. By 1944, the Red Army had mastered these techniques. German intelligence tried to interpret Soviet intentions using reconnaissance aircraft, intercepted communications, and reports from frontline units. But the information was often incomplete or misleading. Many German analysts believed the Soviet Union would continue its major offensives in southern Ukraine. There were logical reasons for this assumption. Southern Ukraine contained valuable resources and important transportation routes. It also offered access to Romania and its oil fields, one of Germany's most critical sources of fuel. Because of this, German commanders expected the Red Army to continue pressing toward the Balkans. As a result, Reinforcements were sent to southern sectors of the front. But the Soviet plan was different. The main blow would fall in Belarus, directly against Army Group Center. Army Group Center occupied a vast region of forests, rivers, and marshlands. Its defensive positions were built around several important cities including Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk. These cities functioned as defensive strongpoints. German strategy relied on holding these positions while mobile reserves counterattacked any Soviet breakthroughs. The system could work if the reserves existed and if the enemy attack was limited. But by 1944, German reserves were dangerously thin. Several experienced divisions had already been transferred to other fronts. Some were sent to France to defend against the expected Allied invasion. Others were committed to desperate fighting in southern Ukraine. As a result, Army Group Center was left with fewer mobile armored units than it had previously possessed. The defensive system was still formidable on paper, but its ability to respond to large-scale breakthroughs had been weakened. Another critical problem was Hitler's command policy. By 1944, Adolf Hitler had increasingly centralized control over military decisions. German commanders in the field often had limited authority to withdraw or reposition their forces without direct approval. Hitler believed that holding ground at all costs was essential. He frequently ordered units to defend cities as fortified places that were not allowed to retreat. These orders created rigid defensive positions that could become traps. If Soviet forces surrounded these strongpoints, the garrisons might be unable to withdraw in time. Some German officers understood this danger. They warned that flexible defense and controlled withdrawals might preserve the army's strength. But Hitler often rejected such proposals. He believed retreat signaled weakness. Instead, many German units were ordered to hold their positions even when they were threatened with encirclement. This policy would have severe consequences during Operation Bagration. While German command structures were becoming more rigid, the Soviet army was becoming more flexible. Red Army commanders increasingly emphasized deep operations, a doctrine that aimed not just to break the front line, but to penetrate far behind enemy defenses. Instead of advancing slowly, Soviet mechanized forces would push deep into German rear areas, cutting supply lines and trapping entire formations. To counter this type of offensive required strong reserves and rapid coordination. Army Group Center had neither. Communication networks were also vulnerable. German supply routes relied heavily on railways and roads running through major cities. If these routes were cut, units on the front line could quickly find themselves isolated. Fuel shortages made the situation even worse. Germany's armored forces depended on reliable fuel supplies to conduct counterattacks. But by 1944, fuel deliveries were increasingly irregular. Some units simply did not have enough fuel to move quickly when needed. Air power also played an important role. Earlier in the war, the German Luftwaffe had often dominated the skies over the Eastern Front. But by 1944, the situation had changed dramatically. The Soviet Air Force had expanded rapidly and was now capable of providing strong support for ground offensives. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was struggling with pilot shortages, fuel problems, and aircraft losses. German ground troops could no longer rely on consistent air support. When the Soviet offensive began, German soldiers would face massive artillery bombardments, large armored formations, and increasing Soviet air activity, often without significant support from their own aircraft. All of these factors combined to create a dangerous imbalance. Army Group Center still looked strong on maps. Its divisions still occupied defensive lines. But the structure behind those lines was fragile. The German command underestimated the scale of the coming Soviet attack. They believed the front could hold. They believed Soviet offensives could be contained. They believed the defensive system would function as it had before. But Operation Bagration was not an ordinary offensive. It was a coordinated assault designed to break the entire structure of the German front. When the attack began, the weaknesses of Army Group Center would be exposed rapidly. The German army had faced Soviet offensives before, but never one prepared on this scale. And never one aimed so deliberately at complete destruction. Soon, the first artillery shells would begin to fall, and the fragile German front would begin to crack. Chapter 3: Soviet Deception and Preparation. By the spring of 1944, Soviet commanders were no longer fighting the same kind of war they had fought in 1941. During the early years of the conflict, The Red Army often reacted to German moves rather than shaping the battlefield itself. Large Soviet formations were caught unprepared, surrounded, and destroyed. But 3 years of brutal fighting had transformed the Soviet military. Commanders had learned difficult lessons. By 1944, the Red Army was capable of planning and executing operations on an enormous scale. These operations were no longer simple frontal assaults. They were complex, carefully coordinated campaigns involving deception, logistics, artillery, armored forces, and air power. Operation Bagration would be one of the most sophisticated examples of this new approach. Before a single shot was fired, the battle had already begun, through deception. Soviet military doctrine placed great importance on maskirovka, a system of camouflage, misinformation, and operational secrecy designed to confuse the enemy. Maskirovka was not a single tactic. It was an entire strategy of deception. Troop movements were hidden from aerial reconnaissance. Radio transmissions were manipulated to create false impressions of army locations. Dummy tanks and artillery positions were constructed to mislead observers. Fake engineering works suggested attacks in sectors where no offensive would actually occur. The goal was simple: ensure that German commanders could not correctly identify where the main Soviet attack would fall. For Operation Bagration, this deception campaign was extensive. Soviet forces deliberately created the impression that their major summer offensive would occur in southern Ukraine. This region had already seen heavy fighting earlier in 1944, and it contained important strategic objectives including access to Romania and the oil fields that supplied much of Germany's fuel. German intelligence analysts believed that the Red Army would likely continue advancing in that direction. Soviet planners encouraged this belief. Radio signals from units in Ukraine were increased to simulate preparations for a large offensive. Engineering works and troop movements in the south were made visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. Meanwhile, in Belarus, where the real attack would occur, Soviet forces operated under strict secrecy. Large formations moved at night. Equipment was concealed under forest cover. Radio silence was maintained whenever possible. Entire armies assembled behind the front line without revealing their full strength. As a result, German intelligence estimates significantly underestimated the size of Soviet forces gathering in Belarus. Many German commanders believed the Red Army was preparing for limited local attacks rather than a massive strategic offensive. The deception had worked. While German attention focused elsewhere, Soviet forces quietly built one of the largest concentrations of military power on the Eastern Front. By June 1944, the scale of the preparation was enormous. Operation Bagration involved 4 major Soviet fronts, equivalent to large army groups. These were the First Baltic Front, the Third Belarusian Front, the Second Belarusian Front, the First Belarusian Front. Together, these formations contained more than 2 million soldiers. They were supported by approximately 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 30,000 artillery pieces and mortars, more than 5,000 aircraft. This concentration of force represented years of Soviet industrial mobilization. Factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains had been producing weapons at massive rates. Tanks such as the T-34, artillery guns, and aircraft were arriving at the front faster than Germany could replace its own losses. But equipment alone could not win battles. Logistics was equally important. An offensive on the scale of Bagration required enormous amounts of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Railways carried equipment toward the front. Bridges were constructed across rivers. Forward supply depots were established. Medical facilities and repair workshops were organized behind the advancing armies. Soviet planners understood that maintaining momentum was essential. Once the attack began, armored units would move rapidly. If supply lines could not keep up, the advance might stall. Every detail had to be prepared in advance. Artillery played a particularly important role in the Soviet plan. By 1944, the Red Army had developed extremely powerful artillery tactics. Instead of scattered bombardments, Soviet forces concentrated thousands of guns to produce massive barrages capable of destroying defensive positions and opening paths for advancing infantry and tanks. Before the attack began, artillery units carefully mapped German positions. Observation posts identified enemy bunkers, artillery batteries, and communication centers. When the offensive started, these targets would be struck simultaneously across a wide front. The objective was not just to damage German defenses. It was to overwhelm them completely. Air power would also support the operation. The Soviet Air Force had grown dramatically since the early years of the war. Aircraft would attack German supply routes, communication centers, and retreating columns. At the same time, fighter aircraft would attempt to limit German air activity over the battlefield. Another important element of the Soviet plan was deep penetration. Earlier in the war, many offensives had focused mainly on pushing enemy forces backward. Operation Bagration aimed for something far more destructive. Once the initial German defenses were broken, Soviet armored units would advance deep behind enemy lines. Their mission was to capture road junctions, railways, and bridges. By doing so, they would isolate German frontline units from reinforcements and supplies. This method was designed to create large encirclements. Instead of fighting German divisions one by one, the Red Army intended to trap entire armies and destroy them. German commanders did not fully anticipate this scale of coordination. Many believed Soviet offensives would remain limited in depth. But by 1944, the Red Army had developed the operational capability to conduct multiple breakthroughs simultaneously. The attack would not occur at a single point. It would strike along a wide front, forcing German defenses to collapse in multiple places at once. Once the offensive began, German command would face an overwhelming problem. Where should reserves be sent? Which breakthrough represented the main Soviet thrust? How could they stabilize a front that was collapsing everywhere at once? These questions would soon become impossible to answer. The final detail of Soviet planning was timing. The offensive would begin on June 22, 1944. The date was chosen deliberately. 3 years earlier, on June 22, 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet leadership understood the symbolic importance of the anniversary. Now the Red Army would launch its own massive offensive on the same date. The message was clear. The Soviet Union had survived the invasion. Now it would carry the war westward. In the forests and fields of Belarus, the preparations were complete. German intelligence believed the sector was relatively quiet. German commanders believed their defenses could hold. But behind the Soviet front lines, 2 million soldiers were waiting. Thousands of artillery pieces were already aimed at German positions. Tank engines were silent in the forests. Aircraft stood ready on airfields. The deception had succeeded. The armies were in position. And on the morning of June 22, the artillery would open fire. Chapter 4. The Artillery Storm Begins. June 22, 1944. Dawn had barely broken over the forests and marshes of Belarus when the silence of the front disappeared. At exactly the moment chosen by Soviet command, thousands of artillery guns opened fire. The ground shook as one of the largest bombardments of the war began. 4 German soldiers along the front line, the attack was sudden and overwhelming. The sky filled with the sound of shells passing overhead. Explosions tore through trenches, bunkers, communication posts, and artillery positions. The barrage did not last a few minutes. It continued for hours. This was not random shelling. Soviet artillery had spent weeks studying German defensive positions. Observers had identified machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, headquarters buildings, and supply depots. Now those targets were being hit simultaneously across a wide front. Entire sections of German defenses disappeared under smoke, dust, and fire. Telephone lines were cut almost immediately. Many frontline units lost contact with their headquarters within minutes of the bombardment beginning. Officers struggled to understand what was happening. Reports from different sectors began arriving at German command posts. Everywhere the message was the same: massive artillery fire, far heavier than previous Soviet attacks. For many German soldiers, the bombardment itself was terrifying. Shells exploded in rapid succession, collapsing trenches and burying men under earth and debris. Concrete bunkers that had been expected to withstand bombardment began to crack or collapse under repeated hits from heavy artillery. Even when the shells did not land directly on a position, the shockwaves shook the ground violently. The psychological effect was enormous. German soldiers who had fought through years of combat were accustomed to artillery fire. But the scale of this barrage was something different. It felt as though the entire front was under attack at once. Behind the artillery storm, Soviet infantry units prepared to move forward. This was another lesson the Red Army had learned during the war. Artillery alone could damage defenses, but it was infantry and armored units that would exploit the destruction. Soviet infantry moved forward behind what was known as a rolling barrage. Artillery shells struck the German lines just ahead of advancing troops, forcing defenders to stay under cover. As the infantry advanced, the artillery fire moved forward in stages, clearing a path through the defensive system. In some sectors, the bombardment was so intense that German positions were already in chaos before Soviet soldiers even reached the front line. Many defenders were stunned, injured, or buried by collapsing trenches. When the Soviet infantry arrived, resistance was often disorganized. But not everywhere. Some German units survived the bombardment relatively intact. These soldiers fought fiercely, using machine guns and rifles to slow the advancing Soviet troops. Even under heavy artillery fire, the German army remained a disciplined fighting force. In certain positions, Soviet infantry took heavy casualties attempting to break through. But the key difference between earlier Soviet offensives and Operation Bagration was scale. The attack did not occur in just one location. It struck across multiple sectors simultaneously. German commanders quickly realized that the offensive was not a local attack. Entire sections of the front were under pressure at the same time. This created a serious problem. Normally, German doctrine relied on quickly moving reserve units to seal breakthroughs. If Soviet forces broke through in one sector, armored divisions would counterattack and restore the line. But on June 22, breakthroughs were appearing everywhere. Communications were disrupted. Roads were crowded with retreating vehicles, artillery units, and supply trucks attempting to move away from the bombardment zones. Some German commanders attempted to organize counterattacks, but they lacked clear information about the scale of the Soviet advance. Reports were confused and sometimes contradictory. In several areas, Soviet engineers began clearing minefields under fire. Once paths were opened, Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns began moving forward. The appearance of armor changed the battle immediately. Infantry assaults could sometimes be stopped by machine gun fire. Armored formations were far harder to contain. German anti-tank guns attempted to engage the advancing tanks, but many of these weapons had already been damaged or destroyed during the artillery bombardment. Where anti-tank defenses remained intact, they could slow the Soviet advance. But again, the problem for Germany was not a single attack. It was multiple simultaneous breakthroughs. In the north, Soviet forces attacked near Vitebsk. Further south, powerful assaults struck near Orsha and Mogilev. Still further south, Soviet armies attacked toward Bobruisk. Each of these attacks involved large numbers of troops and heavy equipment. German commanders were forced to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. Which sector represented the main Soviet effort? Where should the limited reserves be sent? How serious were the breakthroughs already reported? These questions became urgent within the first day of the offensive. Meanwhile, the artillery bombardment continued to play its role. Even after the initial barrage ended, Soviet guns continued firing in support of advancing troops. German artillery units attempted to respond, but many had already been damaged or destroyed. Ammunition shortages also limited their ability to sustain long counter-bombardments. For soldiers on the ground, the battlefield became increasingly chaotic. Smoke from burning vehicles and shattered buildings filled the air. Roads became clogged with damaged equipment and wounded soldiers attempting to move to the rear. Supply trucks struggled to navigate the destruction left by the artillery barrage. German officers attempted to reorganize defensive lines behind the front. But Soviet forces were moving quickly. The carefully constructed German defensive system was beginning to break apart. Positions that had been expected to hold for days were collapsing within hours. By the end of the first day, it was already clear that this offensive was far larger than anything German commanders had expected in Belarus. But the worst was still ahead. Because once the front line began to crack, Soviet armored forces would move through the gaps. And when they did, the real destruction of Army Group Center would begin. Chapter 5: The First Breakthroughs. By the end of the first day of Operation Bagration, the German front line was already under enormous pressure. But the true danger for Army Group Center was not the initial artillery bombardment or the infantry assaults. It was what followed. Soviet commanders had planned the offensive in phases. The first phase was designed to shatter the German defensive line. The second phase was far more dangerous: rapid armored exploitation. Once the front line cracked, Soviet tank and mechanized units would push through the openings and drive deep into the German rear. This is exactly what began to happen on June 23. Across several sectors, Soviet forces achieved the first major breakthroughs. One of the most critical areas was near the city of Orsha. Orsha was an important transportation hub. Railways and major roads passed through the city, connecting German frontline forces with their supply bases further west. German command had fortified the region heavily. Anti-tank guns, minefields, and strong defensive positions were constructed to prevent a breakthrough. But Soviet planners knew this. Instead of attacking directly into the strongest points, they identified weaker sectors between German divisions. Here, massive artillery bombardments and concentrated infantry attacks created small gaps in the line. At first these gaps were narrow, sometimes only a few kilometers wide. But for Soviet commanders, that was enough. Through those openings came the armored spearheads. Soviet tank units began moving forward rapidly, bypassing isolated pockets of German resistance. Their objective was not simply to capture ground. Their objective was to move fast enough to prevent the Germans from reorganizing their defenses. German units that attempted to retreat often found that Soviet armored forces had already cut the roads behind them. Supply convoys were attacked. Communication centers were captured. Railway junctions fell into Soviet hands. Within hours, German command posts began receiving alarming reports. Soviet tanks had appeared far behind the original front line. Entire sectors were becoming disconnected from each other. The German defensive system relied heavily on coordination between divisions. But as Soviet forces pushed deeper into the rear areas, that coordination began to collapse. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry continued pressing forward along the entire front. Where German positions were still holding, fresh Soviet units were brought forward to maintain pressure. This constant pressure prevented German forces from stabilizing the situation. One breakthrough might have been contained. Several simultaneous breakthroughs created chaos. German commanders now faced a growing strategic dilemma. The traditional German response to a breakthrough was to launch a counterattack using mobile armored reserves. But by 1944, Army Group Center had very few armored reserves available. Several panzer divisions had already been transferred to other sectors of the Eastern Front or to France, where German command expected the Allied invasion to occur. Those units that remained were spread thinly across the front. Some were too far away to respond quickly. Others lacked sufficient fuel to move immediately. As a result, German counterattacks were slow and limited. When they did occur, they sometimes achieved temporary success. German armored units were still dangerous opponents. Their tanks and experienced crews could inflict heavy losses on Soviet formations. But these counterattacks lacked the scale needed to reverse the overall situation. While German units fought to restore the front in one sector, Soviet forces were breaking through somewhere else. The offensive had become too large to contain. Another major breakthrough developed near Bobruisk in the southern sector of Army Group Center. Here Soviet forces attacked German positions held by the German Ninth Army. Once again, massive artillery fire preceded the assault. Soviet infantry advanced through shattered defensive lines while engineers cleared paths through minefields. Soon, Soviet tanks began moving through the gaps. German units attempted to hold defensive positions around key towns and road junctions. But Soviet armored forces avoided these strongpoints whenever possible. Instead of attacking directly, they moved around them. German troops defending these positions soon discovered that Soviet forces had already moved past them. This created isolated pockets of resistance. German units found themselves surrounded without realizing it immediately. Some attempted to retreat westward, only to discover that Soviet tanks had already blocked the roads. Others continued fighting in place, hoping reinforcements would arrive. But in many cases, those reinforcements were already cut off. The battlefield began to fragment. Instead of a continuous front line, there were now scattered groups of German soldiers fighting in different directions. Communication between units became increasingly difficult. Telephone lines had been destroyed during the artillery bombardment. Radio communication was unreliable and often overwhelmed by the number of emergency messages being transmitted simultaneously. German headquarters struggled to build a clear picture of the battlefield. Reports arriving from the front described Soviet tanks moving deep into German rear areas. But it was often unclear how large these formations were or exactly where they were heading. Some commanders believed the situation could still be stabilized. Others realized the danger was far greater. If the Soviet armored spearheads continued advancing at this speed, they could surround entire German armies. By the evening of June 23, the situation for Army Group Center had become extremely serious. The front line had not simply been pushed backward. It had been broken. And through the broken front, Soviet mechanized forces were moving rapidly toward critical cities and transportation routes. The German defensive system depended on those routes. If they were lost, the entire structure of the front could collapse. This was exactly what Soviet planners intended. Operation Bagration was not designed merely to gain territory. It was designed to destroy Army Group Center as an organized fighting force. And now the first stage of that destruction was already underway. Soon, one of the first major German strongpoints would be surrounded, the city of Vitebsk. And when it fell, the collapse of the northern sector would accelerate dramatically. Chapter 6. The Destruction of Vitebsk. Among the key positions in the northern sector of Army Group Center stood the city of Vitebsk. For German command, Vitebsk was more than a city. It was a fortress anchoring the northern defensive line in Belarus. Roads and railways running through the city connected several German divisions and allowed supplies to reach the front. Because of this, German leadership declared Vitebsk a fortified place. This designation came with strict orders. The city was not to be abandoned. Its garrison was expected to hold the position regardless of circumstances. In theory, such fortified positions could slow enemy advances and stabilize the front. In practice, they often became traps. As Operation Bagration unfolded, Soviet forces moved rapidly toward Vitebsk from several directions. The German divisions defending the city soon realized they were facing a far larger offensive than expected. Massive artillery bombardments struck the defensive lines surrounding the city. Soviet infantry attacked through the shattered positions, followed closely by armored units pushing deeper into German territory. Within days, Soviet forces began closing around Vitebsk. The city was no longer a defensive anchor. It was becoming an encircled pocket. German commanders on the ground understood the danger quickly. Some officers requested permission to withdraw their troops before the Soviet encirclement was complete. A timely withdrawal might have saved tens of thousands of soldiers. But the decision was not theirs to make. Adolf Hitler had already issued strict instructions. Vitebsk must be held. German units were ordered to remain in place. Even as Soviet forces moved around the city, the garrison was expected to continue fighting. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders were executing the next phase of their plan. Instead of attacking directly into the city immediately, they focused on closing the encirclement. Armored units moved around the German positions, capturing key roads and bridges behind the city. Supply routes were cut. Railway connections disappeared. Within a short time, several German divisions found themselves completely surrounded. The Soviet encirclement was not perfect at first. Small gaps existed where German troops attempted to escape westward. But these gaps were closing rapidly. German columns trying to withdraw often ran directly into advancing Soviet tank units. Vehicles were destroyed on narrow forest roads. Supply trucks and artillery pieces were abandoned as soldiers attempted to escape on foot. Inside the city, the situation deteriorated quickly. The German garrison consisted of tens of thousands of soldiers from several divisions. They were well armed and experienced, but they now faced a major problem. They were cut off from the rest of the army. Food and ammunition supplies were limited. Medical facilities became overwhelmed as wounded soldiers filled improvised field hospitals. Communication with higher headquarters was unreliable. German commanders attempted to organize defensive lines within the city itself. Buildings were turned into strongpoints. Machine guns were positioned at intersections. Anti-tank weapons were prepared to defend against Soviet armor. But the defenders knew their situation was becoming hopeless. Outside the city, Soviet artillery continued bombarding German positions. Aircraft attacked supply depots and transportation routes. Meanwhile, Soviet infantry and tanks gradually tightened the ring around the encircled garrison. By late June, the encirclement was complete. The trapped German forces had little chance of escape. Some officers proposed organizing a breakout attempt. But such an operation required coordination, fuel, and mobility. resources the surrounded troops did not possess in sufficient quantities. Even if a breakout had been attempted earlier, Soviet armored units were already controlling most of the surrounding roads. The window of opportunity had closed. The Soviet command now moved to destroy the pocket. Artillery bombardments resumed, targeting German defensive positions inside the city. Soviet infantry attacked from several directions simultaneously. Street fighting erupted as Soviet soldiers moved through the outskirts of Vitebsk. German troops fought stubbornly. Many units resisted until they were overwhelmed. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Within days, organized resistance collapsed. Thousands of German soldiers were killed in the fighting. Tens of thousands more were captured. Several entire German divisions effectively ceased to exist. For Army Group Center, the loss of Vitebsk was catastrophic. The northern sector of the front had not simply been pushed backward. It had been torn open. Soviet forces now had a clear path to advance deeper into Belarus. The destruction of the Vitebsk garrison also sent a powerful signal to other German units along the front. If Soviet encirclement tactics succeeded elsewhere, entire armies could be trapped in the same way. And that was exactly what Soviet commanders intended. Because while Vitebsk was collapsing in the north, Soviet forces were advancing toward other key cities. The next target was even more important. The capital of Belarus, Minsk. And if Minsk fell, the fate of Army Group Center would be sealed. Chapter 7. The Fall of Minsk. As the destruction of the German forces at Vitebsk became clear, Soviet commanders did not slow their advance. Operation Bagration had been designed for momentum. Once the front line collapsed, armored and mechanized units were expected to move quickly through the gaps and strike deep behind German positions. Now that phase was fully underway. The next objective was the most important city in the region, Minsk. Minsk was the capital of Belarus and one of the most critical transportation hubs on the entire Eastern Front. Railways and highways running through the city connected German armies in the east with supply bases in Poland and Germany. If Minsk were lost, the logistical backbone of Army Group Center would collapse. Soviet commanders understood this clearly. Armored units began racing westward toward the city. Instead of moving slowly in organized formations, Soviet tank armies advanced in long columns, pushing as far as possible each day. Speed was essential. The objective was not only to capture Minsk. The objective was to trap the German armies retreating toward it. Meanwhile, the German situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Army Group Center was no longer able to maintain a continuous front line. Entire sectors had already collapsed. Divisions that had once defended fortified positions were now retreating along narrow roads through forests and villages, trying to reach new defensive lines further west. But the German retreat was chaotic. Vehicles clogged the roads. Fuel shortages slowed movement. Communication between units was often unreliable or completely broken. German headquarters struggled to determine where their own divisions were located. Some units had already been destroyed. Others were retreating in small scattered groups. And still others were unknowingly marching into areas already controlled by Soviet forces. This confusion played directly into the Soviet strategy. Instead of attacking German forces head-on during their retreat, Soviet armored units pushed ahead to cut off escape routes. Tank columns moved toward key road intersections. Mechanized infantry captured bridges. Motorized reconnaissance units searched for retreating German columns. The battlefield was becoming a vast network of traps. German soldiers moving west toward Minsk increasingly discovered that the roads they were following were already blocked. Columns of vehicles would suddenly encounter Soviet tanks waiting across the road. Anti-tank guns and machine guns opened fire. Panic spread through the retreating formations. Some units attempted to turn south or north to find alternative routes. But Soviet forces were appearing everywhere. The encirclement was forming. By the end of June 1944, Soviet armies had advanced hundreds of kilometers in some sectors. German commanders were shocked by the speed of the advance. The Red Army had achieved exactly what its planners intended: deep penetration behind the German front. Now the trap around Minsk began to close. German forces retreating toward the city were gradually surrounded. Entire corps found themselves trapped east of Minsk. Estimates suggest that more than 100,000 German soldiers became encircled in the region. Some units attempted desperate breakout attempts. At night, columns of soldiers tried to slip through forests and swamps to escape westward. But Soviet patrols and armored units controlled most of the surrounding roads. Aircraft attacked retreating columns from the air. Artillery bombarded escape routes. German soldiers often found themselves fighting in every direction at once. Inside the pocket, supplies quickly began to run out. Fuel was almost gone. Ammunition was limited. Food supplies were exhausted within days. Many wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. Command structures collapsed as officers were killed or separated from their units. What remained of Army Group Center was disintegrating into isolated groups of soldiers trying to survive. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued advancing toward Minsk itself. On July 3, 1944, Soviet troops entered the city. The German garrison had already withdrawn or been destroyed. Minsk fell quickly. For the Soviet Union, the liberation of Minsk was a major symbolic victory. For Germany, it marked the collapse of the central sector of the Eastern Front. But the fall of the city was not the most devastating part of the battle. The true disaster was happening just east of Minsk. There, the encircled German forces were being systematically destroyed. Over the following days, Soviet troops tightened the ring around the trapped German units. Attempts to organize coordinated breakouts failed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. Thousands more were killed while trying to escape. Only small groups managed to slip through the Soviet lines. The destruction of the Minsk pocket effectively ended the organized resistance of Army Group Center. 4 German armies had been shattered. Entire divisions had disappeared. The German defensive line that once stretched across Belarus no longer existed. And the Red Army was still advancing. The road to Poland was now open. But for German command, the disaster of Minsk raised an urgent question. Could the front be stabilized anywhere at all? Or had the entire center of the Eastern Front collapsed beyond repair? The answer would soon become clear. Because while German forces attempted to reorganize further west, Soviet armies were already preparing to continue their advance. Chapter 8. Encirclement of Army Group Center. By early July 1944, the scale of the disaster facing Germany was becoming impossible to ignore. The fall of Minsk had not simply forced a German retreat. It had shattered the central structure of the Eastern Front. Army Group Center, once one of the strongest formations in the German army, was collapsing. The destruction around Minsk represented one of the largest encirclements of the entire war. Entire German corps had been trapped east of the city. Soviet forces surrounded them from multiple directions, cutting off any organized escape routes. 4 German soldiers inside the pocket, the situation quickly became desperate. Thousands of men were packed into forests, villages, and narrow roadways while Soviet artillery continued firing into the trapped area. Food supplies were gone. Fuel was gone. Many soldiers had only the ammunition they carried with them. Wounded soldiers lay in improvised field hospitals with almost no medical supplies. German officers attempted to organize breakout attempts. The plan was simple. Small groups would attempt to move west through forests and swamps, avoiding major roads where Soviet armored units were already waiting. But the terrain made escape extremely difficult. Belarus was covered in dense forests and wetlands. Movement was slow even for small groups. And Soviet forces were tightening the encirclement every day. Armored units blocked roads. Infantry patrols swept through villages. Aircraft searched for moving columns and attacked them whenever they were spotted. Every attempt to escape risked running directly into Soviet positions. Some German units attempted large coordinated breakouts. At night, columns of soldiers moved westward hoping to punch through the encirclement. These attempts often ended in disaster. Soviet artillery and machine gun fire broke up the formations. Tanks blocked the roads. Thousands of soldiers were killed in the attempts. Others surrendered when it became clear that escape was impossible. Meanwhile, Soviet forces methodically reduced the pocket. Instead of rushing into chaotic fighting, Soviet commanders used artillery and coordinated infantry attacks to compress the encircled area gradually. Each day the ring became smaller. Each day German resistance weakened. Entire groups of exhausted soldiers emerged from forests carrying white flags. Many had marched for days with little food or water. For them, the war was effectively over. Estimates suggest that more than 100,000 German soldiers were captured during the destruction of the Minsk pocket. Thousands more were killed in the fighting. Entire divisions ceased to exist as organized units. For the Soviet Union, The victory was enormous. The destruction of Army Group Center represented one of the greatest operational successes of the entire war. But for Germany, the consequences were catastrophic. Army Group Center had formed the backbone of German defenses in Belarus. Now that backbone had been broken. The front line no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Large gaps had opened across hundreds of kilometers. German command attempted to reorganize surviving units further west. Fragments of destroyed divisions were gathered into improvised defensive groups. New defensive positions were planned along rivers and major transportation routes. But there was a problem. The Red Army was not slowing down. Soviet armored units continued advancing rapidly westward. They crossed rivers, captured towns, and pushed deeper toward Poland. German forces attempting to establish new defensive lines often discovered that Soviet units had already moved beyond them. The speed of the Soviet advance shocked many German officers. Earlier in the war, the German army had used similar tactics: rapid armored breakthroughs followed by deep penetrations into enemy rear areas. Now the Red Army was using the same methods against them. And it was working. Meanwhile, German command struggled to understand how the disaster had become so severe. Only weeks earlier, Army Group Center had appeared relatively stable. Now it had been almost completely destroyed. The losses were staggering. Dozens of divisions had been eliminated or severely damaged. Thousands of vehicles had been lost. Artillery units had disappeared. Communication networks had collapsed. Even experienced German commanders admitted that the scale of the defeat was unprecedented. For the Red Army, the destruction of Army Group Center opened enormous opportunities. With the central German defenses gone, Soviet armies could advance toward new strategic objectives: Poland, the Baltic states, and eventually Germany itself. But the offensive was not yet finished. Although Army Group Center had been shattered, surviving German forces were still attempting to regroup. The next question was whether Germany could rebuild a defensive line before the Red Army advanced even further west. Because if Soviet forces continued their momentum, the road toward the borders of Germany itself would soon be open. And the collapse that began in Belarus might spread across the entire Eastern Front. Chapter 9. German attempts to stabilize the front. By mid-July 1944, the German High Command was facing a disaster unlike anything it had experienced since the beginning of the war. The destruction of Army Group Center had opened a massive gap in the Eastern Front. Entire German armies had disappeared. Defensive lines that had once stretched across Belarus no longer existed. What remained were fragments, scattered divisions, small groups of survivors, improvised defensive formations built from units that had retreated or escaped encirclement. German commanders now faced a desperate task: rebuild a front line before the Soviet advance reached even deeper into Eastern Europe. The responsibility for this effort fell largely on Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders. Model had developed a reputation during the war for stabilizing collapsing fronts. Whenever the situation became critical, Hitler often sent him to restore order. But even Model understood that the situation in Belarus was extremely dangerous. The destruction of Army Group Center had not been a simple defeat. It had been an operational collapse. More than 24 German divisions had been destroyed or crippled. Armored units had lost most of their vehicles. Artillery formations had lost guns and ammunition. The German army was no longer defending a continuous line. Instead, it was attempting to build new defensive positions while retreating. Model immediately began organizing whatever forces he could gather. Surviving soldiers were grouped together regardless of their original divisions. Infantry units were reinforced with remnants of artillery and support troops. Any available armored vehicles were assigned to defensive sectors where Soviet advances appeared strongest. But rebuilding an army in the middle of a retreat was extraordinarily difficult. Roads were clogged with damaged vehicles and retreating soldiers. Communication lines were unreliable. Many units had lost contact with their commanders entirely. Some soldiers did not even know where the front line was supposed to be. Meanwhile, Soviet forces continued pushing westward. Red Army tank armies moved quickly along major roads and railways, capturing towns and supply depots before German forces could organize defenses. In many areas, German soldiers arriving to defend a position discovered that Soviet units had already advanced past them. This created a dangerous situation for German command. Without a stable defensive line, Soviet forces could advance almost anywhere. Model attempted to establish new defensive positions along natural barriers such as rivers. Rivers could slow armored advances and provide stronger defensive terrain. But even these positions were difficult to hold. German units often arrived exhausted, short of ammunition, and lacking heavy weapons. In contrast, Soviet forces advancing behind Operation Bagration were well supplied. Large supply columns followed the advancing armies. Railways were repaired quickly to move ammunition and fuel closer to the front. The Red Army had learned from earlier offensives that maintaining supply lines was essential to keeping momentum. Another problem facing Germany was air superiority. Earlier in the war, the Luftwaffe had often supported German defensive operations by attacking enemy armored columns and providing reconnaissance. But by 1944, the Luftwaffe was severely weakened. Many experienced pilots had been lost. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Allied bombing of German airfields and factories had reduced aircraft production and operational readiness. As a result, Soviet aircraft were increasingly active over the battlefield. They attacked retreating German columns. They bombed road intersections and bridges. They disrupted attempts to organize new defensive lines. For German soldiers on the ground, this created a constant sense of pressure. Even when they managed to withdraw to a new position, Soviet aircraft might appear overhead and attack within hours. Despite these difficulties, German resistance did not collapse completely. Some units fought stubbornly to delay the Soviet advance. Experienced German officers used defensive tactics designed to slow attacking forces. Anti-tank guns were placed along likely tank routes. Machine gun positions covered open ground. Small counterattacks were launched to disrupt Soviet spearheads. These defensive efforts sometimes succeeded in slowing Soviet progress temporarily. But they could not reverse the overall momentum. The Red Army had too many soldiers, too many tanks, and too much artillery. Every time German forces attempted to stabilize one sector, Soviet commanders attacked somewhere else. The offensive continued spreading westward. Within weeks, Soviet forces reached the borders of Poland and the Baltic states. Cities that had been under German control since 1941 were now being liberated one after another. Vilnius, Grodno, Brest. The front was moving rapidly toward Central Europe. For the German High Command, the realization was unavoidable. Operation Bagration had not only destroyed Army Group Center, it had transformed the entire strategic situation on the Eastern Front. Germany could still fight. German soldiers were still capable of defending territory. But the ability to control the pace of the war had been lost. Now Germany was reacting to Soviet moves rather than shaping the battlefield. The Red Army had seized the initiative completely. And as Soviet forces continued advancing westward, a new and frightening possibility began to emerge. For the first time since the war had begun, the road toward Germany itself was beginning to open. Chapter 10. Why the Wehrmacht could not recover. By the late summer of 1944, the destruction of Army Group Center was no longer just a battlefield disaster. It had become a strategic turning point. German commanders had managed to slow the Soviet advance in some sectors. New defensive lines had been established along rivers and around major cities. Surviving units had been reorganized. But the fundamental problem remained. The German army could no longer recover from losses on the scale inflicted during Operation Bagration. Several factors made recovery almost impossible. The first was manpower. The German army had already suffered enormous casualties during the previous years of the war. Battles such as Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long defensive campaigns of 1943 had consumed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. By 1944, Germany was facing a severe shortage of trained manpower. Replacement soldiers still arrived at the front, but many of them had received only limited training. Some were very young recruits. Others were older men pulled from reserve units or previously exempt occupations. These new soldiers could not easily replace the experienced veterans lost during the destruction of Army Group Center. Entire divisions that had once contained seasoned combat troops were now being rebuilt with inexperienced replacements. This weakened the effectiveness of German defensive operations. The second major problem was equipment. During the collapse of Army Group Center, enormous quantities of military equipment had been lost. Tanks abandoned during the retreat. Artillery destroyed during Soviet bombardments. Vehicles captured or burned on clogged roads. Even basic supplies such as ammunition, radios, and engineering equipment disappeared during the chaos of encirclement and retreat. Germany's industrial system attempted to replace these losses, but by 1944 it was under intense pressure. Allied strategic bombing was striking German factories, railways, and oil facilities. Production continued, but transportation networks were constantly disrupted. Delivering equipment from factories to the Eastern Front became increasingly difficult. Even when new tanks or guns were produced, getting them to frontline units required functioning railways and fuel. Both were becoming scarce. Fuel shortages were especially serious. Germany relied heavily on oil imported from Romania and synthetic fuel produced in German factories. But Allied bombing campaigns targeted these fuel facilities relentlessly. As a result, many German armored units could not operate at full capacity. Tanks might exist on paper, but without fuel they could not move. Armored counterattacks, once one of the Wehrmacht's most effective tools, became increasingly difficult to organize. The third factor preventing recovery was air superiority. Earlier in the war, German forces often relied on the Luftwaffe to support ground operations. Aircraft could attack enemy armored formations, provide reconnaissance, and disrupt advancing troops. By 1944, this advantage had disappeared. The Soviet Air Force had expanded dramatically. Thousands of aircraft supported Red Army offensives. These aircraft attacked retreating German columns, destroyed bridges, and disrupted supply routes. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe struggled to maintain even limited air activity over the Eastern Front. Many experienced pilots had been killed. Fuel shortages limited flight training and combat missions. As a result, German ground troops increasingly fought without meaningful air support. This gave Soviet forces greater freedom to maneuver. Another critical factor was command structure. German military command had become increasingly centralized under Adolf Hitler. Field commanders often had limited authority to adjust defensive plans without direct approval. Orders frequently emphasized holding ground rather than preserving forces. This rigid approach sometimes prevented German units from withdrawing to more defensible positions. During Operation Bagration, several German strongpoints had been ordered to hold their positions even as Soviet forces moved around them. These orders turned defensive positions into encircled pockets. Entire divisions were lost as a result. Even after the disaster of Bagration, similar command problems continued. German officers in the field understood that flexible defense might slow Soviet advances more effectively. But strategic decisions often remained in the hands of leadership far removed from the battlefield. Finally, the most important factor was industrial imbalance. By 1944, the Soviet Union possessed enormous industrial capacity. Factories east of the Ural Mountains produced tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition at remarkable rates. Losses suffered during offensives could often be replaced within weeks. Germany simply could not match this level of production while fighting on multiple fronts and under constant bombing. Operation Bagration demonstrated the consequences of this imbalance. When Army Group Center collapsed, the Red Army continued advancing with fresh armies and equipment. Germany attempted to rebuild its defenses using limited resources and exhausted troops. The gap between the two sides was growing larger every month. German soldiers continued fighting with determination and skill. Many defensive battles were conducted with remarkable discipline. But discipline alone could not replace lost divisions, lost tanks, or lost fuel. The Wehrmacht still possessed experienced commanders and capable units. What it no longer possessed was the ability to recover from catastrophic defeats. Operation Bagration had removed one of the central pillars of the German Eastern Front. And once that pillar collapsed, the structure supporting Germany's position in Eastern Europe began to crumble. The Red Army was now advancing steadily toward new strategic objectives: Poland, the Baltic region, and eventually the borders of Germany itself. The offensive that began in Belarus was no longer just a Soviet victory. It had become the beginning of the final phase of the war in the East. Chapter 12. The offensive that ended German initiative. By the end of the summer of 1944, the consequences of Operation Bagration had become unmistakable. The German Army Group Center, once one of the strongest formations on the Eastern Front, had effectively ceased to exist. More than 25 German divisions were destroyed or severely damaged during the operation. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Vast quantities of equipment had been lost. Entire defensive systems that had taken years to construct were erased in a matter of weeks. But the importance of Operation Bagration was not measured only in numbers. Its real significance was strategic. Before the summer of 1944, Germany still possessed the ability, at least in theory, to stabilize parts of the Eastern Front. German forces had previously conducted successful defensive operations, slowing Soviet offensives and sometimes launching local counterattacks. After Bagration, that possibility became far more difficult. The destruction of Army Group Center created a massive gap in the German defensive line stretching across hundreds of kilometers. Although German commanders managed to build new defensive positions further west, those lines were weaker and less organized than the ones that had been destroyed. More importantly, the Red Army now possessed overwhelming momentum. Soviet forces had demonstrated that they could coordinate enormous offensives involving multiple army groups, massive artillery concentrations, armored breakthroughs, and deep operational penetration. The Red Army of 1944 was no longer the desperate force that had struggled to survive during the early years of the war. It had become a powerful and experienced military machine. At the same time, Germany was reaching the limits of its capacity to fight a prolonged war. The country faced enormous pressure on every front. In the west, Allied armies were advancing through France and approaching the borders of Germany. In the air, German cities and factories were under constant bombardment. In the Mediterranean, German forces were fighting defensive battles in Italy and the Balkans. Resources were stretched thin. Manpower shortages were growing worse. Fuel supplies were declining rapidly. Even the most skilled commanders could not overcome these structural problems. Operation Bagration revealed this reality with brutal clarity. For the Soviet Union, the victory was one of the greatest achievements of the entire war. The Red Army had liberated Belarus. It had destroyed a major German army group, and it had opened the road toward Poland and Eastern Europe. But Soviet commanders understood that the war was not yet over. The German army was still capable of fierce resistance. Defensive battles in Poland, Hungary, and eventually Germany itself would still cost enormous numbers of lives. Yet the strategic direction of the war had changed permanently. From this point forward, the Red Army would continue advancing westward. Cities that had once served as German headquarters would soon become battlefields. Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, and eventually Berlin. Operation Bagration did not end the war, but it removed one of the last major obstacles standing between the Soviet armies and the heart of Nazi Germany. Historians often describe the Normandy landings as the decisive moment of 1944. But on the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration was equally transformative. It demonstrated the full strength of the Soviet war machine, its armies, its industry, its logistics, and its command structure. It also demonstrated that Germany could no longer recover from catastrophic defeats. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for many months. But the balance of power had shifted beyond repair. The offensive that began in the forests of Belarus had destroyed the central pillar of Germany's eastern defenses. And once that pillar collapsed, the entire structure of the German position in the east began to fall with it. From the ruins of Army Group Center, the Red Army marched west, toward the borders of Germany, and toward the final battles that would end the war in Europe.